The year was 1881, and the wind across the high plains of the territory carried with it the dust of 1,000 lonely miles and the scent of distant rain that rarely fell where it was most needed. Arthur McBride knew this wind. It was an old acquaintance, one that whispered through the ill-fitting slats of his cabin and rattled the panes of the single-glass window he'd painstakingly hauled from town a decade before. His ranch, a spread of parched earth and stubborn grama grass, was a testament to a resilience he sometimes felt had been scraped raw within him, leaving only the bone of habit. He had buried his wife, Martha, and their small son, Tom, 7 years past, victims of a fever that had swept through the scattered homesteads like a prairie fire, indiscriminate and cruel. Since then, his world had shrunk to the boundaries of his land, his voice to the curt commands he gave his horse, and the occasional necessary word exchanged on his infrequent trips to the nearest settlement, a good 2 days' ride east. His stasis was a heavy cloak, woven from grief and solitude. Mornings bled into afternoons, marked only by the shifting shadows and the ceaseless demands of a rancher's life. He mended fences that the wind or stray cattle seemed determined to unravel, tended his small herd, chopped wood, and drew water from a well that seemed to begrudge every bucketful. The silence of his cabin was broken only by the crackle of the fire in winter, or the drone of insects in summer. It was a silence so profound it had weight, pressing down on him, a constant reminder of voices lost. He moved through his days with a stoic competence, his face weathered into a map of sun and sorrow, his eyes holding a distant, guarded look that discouraged casual approach. He asked nothing of the world and expected less. The catalyst arrived, not with a bang, but with the subtlety of a wild creature seeking desperate cover. It was late afternoon, the sky bruised into an impending twilight that promised a cold night. Arthur was in the barn, forking hay into the manger for his aging mare, Bess, when a flicker of movement in the deeper shadows of a vacant stall caught his eye. He paused, pitchfork held ready. Coyotes sometimes grew bold, or perhaps a bobcat, though rare this close to the cabin. He moved slowly, his boots scuffing softly on the packed earth floor. It was not an animal of the four-legged variety. Huddled in the corner, pressed against the rough-hewn timber walls as if trying to merge with them, was a young woman. Or rather, a girl on the cusp of womanhood. Her dark hair, matted with dirt and bits of straw, fell across a face smudged with exhaustion and fear. Her dress, made of some soft, tanned hide, was torn at the shoulder and along the hem, revealing scratches on her skin. She was Native American, that much was clear from her high cheekbones and the almond shape of her eyes, which were wide and terrified, fixed on him like a cornered deer. A Kiowa girl, he guessed from the beadwork on what remained of her moccasins. She was trembling, a fine, continuous tremor that shook her slight frame. Arthur lowered the pitchfork slowly. He was not a man easily startled, but the sheer unexpectedness of her presence, here, in the heart of his solitude, momentarily rooted him to the spot. His first instinct, born of long years of caution in a land where trouble often wore an unfamiliar face, was suspicion. Runaway, likely. But from what, or whom? And why his barn? "Well now," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. It was a neutral sound, neither welcoming nor threatening. "You ain't supposed to be here." The girl flinched at his voice but didn't move, her eyes still locked on his. She looked utterly spent, her breathing shallow and rapid. He saw a darker stain on the sleeve of her dress, near the torn shoulder, that looked like dried blood. His routine, his carefully constructed wall of lonely order, had been breached. An immediate problem presented itself, sharp and unwelcome. He could turn her out, send her on her way. It was the sensible thing, the safe thing. But the memory of Martha's face, pale and trusting even in her final hours, flickered in his mind. He saw the raw fear in the girl's eyes, a fear that transcended language and race. He thought of young Tom, who would have been about her age now, perhaps. The thought was a dull ache, always present. He sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "Reckon you're in some kind of fix," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He took a step back, making his movements slow and deliberate. "Stay put. Don't go runnin'. I'll fetch some water." He left her there, a knot of apprehension tightening in his chest. This was trouble, no doubt about it. Trouble he didn't need, didn't want. But the sight of her, so small and broken in the dim light of his barn, had stirred something in him, something he thought long dead, a reluctant, almost painful, stirring of responsibility. When he returned with a dipper of water and a piece of leftover cornbread, she hadn't moved. Her gaze followed him, wary and intense. He set the water and bread down on the ground, a few feet from her. "Here," he said, gesturing. "Drink, eat." She stared at the offering, then back at him. He could see the struggle in her face, the desperate need versus the ingrained fear. He backed away further, towards the barn door, turning his side to her slightly, to appear less confrontational. He busied himself checking a harness hanging on the wall, though his attention remained fixed on the girl. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached for the dipper. Her hand shook so much that water sloshed over the side. She drank greedily, her throat working. Then she picked up the cornbread and devoured it in a few bites, like a starving animal. Arthur watched her, his expression unreadable. Communication was a chasm between them, bridged only by the most basic human needs and gestures. He knew no Kiowa, and he doubted she knew much English. The silence in the barn was thick with unspoken questions, with suspicion and the raw edge of fear. He observed the way she moved, the quick, darting glances she cast towards the open doorway, the way she kept herself coiled, ready to flee. She was assessing him, just as he was assessing her. He gestured towards the hay in the empty stall. "You can rest there," he said, his voice low. Safer than out in the open tonight. He didn't know if she understood the words, but his tone, his pointing, might convey the meaning. She looked at the hay, then at him. There was no gratitude in her eyes, only a continued, deep-seated wariness. He didn't expect any. He was a white man, an intruder in her world, just as she was in his. For now, it was an uneasy truce, a forced coexistence dictated by her desperation and his reluctant decision not to cast her out into the coming night. Over the next few days, a fragile pattern emerged. Arthur went about his chores, acutely aware of the girl, Mesa. He'd heard her whisper the name once when she thought herself alone, a soft, breathy sound, hidden in his barn. He left food and water for her near the stall, usually when she was out of sight, though he knew she watched him. He found a relatively clean horse blanket and left it for her. The nights were growing colder. He noticed she'd made a small effort to clean herself with water from the trough, and her torn dress had been inexpertly stitched with thread she must have pulled from a discarded grain sack. He made no attempt to approach her directly or question her. He sensed her fear was a wild thing, easily spooked. He spoke occasionally, simple phrases. "Food's there. Storm's comin'." She never replied in words, but sometimes he thought he saw a flicker of understanding, or perhaps just acknowledgement, in her dark eyes. He noticed the wound on her shoulder was a nasty gash, probably from a fall or a sharp branch. He left out a clean rag and a small tin of salve Martha had used for burns and cuts. The next day, the tin was slightly less full, the rag gone. One afternoon, while he was mending a bridle near the barn door, he saw her watching Bess. The old mare had a burr caught in her forelock and was tossing her head irritably. Before Arthur could move, Mesa slipped out of the shadows. She moved with a fluid grace, her bare feet making no sound. She approached Bess slowly, murmuring soft sounds, too low for Arthur to decipher. The mare, usually skittish with strangers, calmed under her touch. Mesa's small, deft fingers worked at the burr, and soon it was free. She smoothed the mare's forelock, her expression softening for a fleeting moment into something almost serene. Then, aware of Arthur's gaze, she retreated back into the shadows of the stall, her guard firmly back in place. Arthur said nothing, but the small act resonated within him. It was a glimpse of the person beneath the fear, a hint of a gentle nature. He found himself thinking about her more than he wanted to. Who was she running from? What had driven her to such desperation? The questions were there, unanswered, hanging in the air between them. He began to see beyond the runaway Indian, to the frightened, resilient young woman. A reluctant protectiveness, unfamiliar and unsettling, began to take root in his hardened heart. He told himself it was just basic human decency, nothing more. But the loneliness of his cabin felt a little less absolute with her presence nearby, even if that presence was silent and hidden. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible. He started leaving a little more food, a piece of dried apple he'd been saving. He found an old patched shawl of Martha's in a trunk and left it out. The nights were sharp now, He didn't see her take it, but the next morning, it was gone. He imagined her wrapped in it, a small measure of warmth against the cold. He still didn't trust her entirely. She was a stranger, from a world that had often been at odds with his own, but the sharp edges of his suspicion were slowly being worn down by her quiet vulnerability and his own grudging empathy. He saw the way she watched the horizon, a constant, haunted vigilance in her eyes, and the weariness that settled on her like dust when she thought no one was looking. One evening, as he ate his solitary meal of beans and bacon by the light of a single lamp in his cabin, he heard a sound outside, a soft scuffling near the woodpile. His hand instinctively went to the old Colt revolver he kept tucked in his waistband. He moved to the door, peering out into the moon-drenched yard. It was Mesa. She was gathering a few fallen branches, her movements quick and furtive. She had clearly seen the smoke from his chimney, understood the need for fire. He watched as she carried the small bundle back towards the barn. He could have stopped her, could have told her to stay put. Instead, he turned back to his meal, a strange mixture of emotions churning within him. She was resourceful, he'd give her that. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was beginning to see his ranch not just as a temporary hiding place, but as a place of relative safety. The fragile peace was shattered a week after Mesa's arrival. Arthur was out on the range, checking a section of fence line that bordered a shallow, rocky arroyo when he saw them. 3 riders, moving with purpose across the sparse grassland to the north. They were too far away to make out clearly, but their bearing was unmistakable. Native men, warriors by their look, and they were riding hard, their eyes scanning the terrain. A cold dread settled in Arthur's stomach. He knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that they were looking for Mesa. He turned Bess and rode back towards the ranch, pushing the mare harder than usual. He had to warn her, to get her hidden more securely. The barn was too obvious. As he neared his property, he saw Mesa by the well, drawing water. He waved urgently, shouting her name, the first time he'd used it aloud to her. "Mesa, riders, coming this way, hide." She looked up, her eyes widening in comprehension and renewed terror. She dropped the bucket, water splashing over her feet, and without a word, darted back towards the barn. Arthur dismounted, his mind racing. Where could she go? The root cellar beneath the cabin was small, cramped, but perhaps the best option. He reached the barn just as she was scrambling into the hayloft. "No," he said, his voice sharp. "They'll look there. Come with me. Quickly." Fear made her hesitate, her eyes darting between him and the open prairie, visible through the barn door. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm, but not rough. "Trust me," he urged, the words stark. "There's no time." He pulled her towards the cabin, half running. The riders were closer now, cresting a small rise about a mile distant. He shoved open the cabin door, hurried her to the trap door leading to the cellar, hidden beneath a worn rug. "In here, and stay quiet, no matter what you hear." She scrambled down into the darkness without a backward glance. He replaced the rug, smoothed it with his boot, then grabbed his rifle from its pegs above the mantelpiece. He stepped outside, positioning himself on the small porch, the rifle held loosely in his hands, watching the riders approach. He felt a grim resolve settle over him. He had made a choice, almost without thinking. He was protecting her. The why of it was a muddle in his head, a tangle of old grief and new, unwelcome empathy. All he knew was that he couldn't just hand her over. The 3 Kiowa warriors reined in their ponies a dozen yards from Arthur's cabin. They were formidable figures, their faces grim, their eyes hard. The one who seemed to be the leader, a tall man with a severe scar tracing his cheekbone, Vokin, fixed Arthur with an unblinking stare. He carried a Winchester of his own, and a hunting knife was sheathed at his belt. His companions were similarly armed, their expressions equally unyielding. "We look for a girl," Vokin said, his English heavily accented but clear enough. "Our blood. She ran from her duty, from her people." Arthur kept his gaze steady, his voice deliberately calm. "Ain't seen no girl. Just me here." It was a weak lie, and he knew it. His ranch was isolated. A stranger would stand out. Vokin's eyes narrowed. "She came this way. Tracks lead here. Small feet. Woman's moccasin print near your well." He gestured with his chin towards the well. "She is Kiowa, Mesa." "You hide her?" The directness of the accusation, The certainty in Vokin's voice tightened the knot in Arthur's chest. The stakes had just escalated dramatically. This wasn't a casual search. These men were determined. The phrase from the half-forgotten rumor mill in town echoed in his mind. Something about a Kiowa girl promised to an older, influential warrior, a girl who had vanished. He remembered the undertone of the gossip, that her family, her clan, would stop at nothing to recover what they saw as their honor, their property. Her family would kill to bring her home, someone had said. He hadn't paid it much mind then. Now, staring into Vokin's implacable eyes, the words had a chilling resonance. "Like I said," Arthur repeated, his grip tightening on his rifle. "I ain't seen her. You're welcome to water your horses, then I'd thank you to be on your way. This is private property." A grim smile touched Vokin's lips, a smile that held no warmth. "We will search your buildings. If she is here, we will find her. If you help her, you become our enemy." The threat hung heavy in the air. Arthur felt a cold sweat prickle his palms. He was one man, old enough to feel the ache in his joints on cold mornings, against three younger, battle-hardened warriors. The odds were not in his favor, but the image of Mesa's terrified face as she'd scrambled into the cellar flashed before him. He thought of the small, almost imperceptible signs of trust she had begun to show, the way she'd cared for Bess. "You won't be searching anywhere," Arthur said, his voice low and steady, belying the tremor he felt inside. "This is my land, my home. You'll respect that, or you'll deal with me." Vokin exchanged a look with his companions. Their expressions hardened further. This white rancher was being stubborn, foolish. He was choosing to stand between them and their quarry. "You are one man," Vokin stated, his hand moving slightly towards the rifle across his saddle. "We are three. This is not your fight." "It is now," Arthur said quietly, but with a firmness that surprised even himself. He saw the flicker of surprise in Vokin's eyes, quickly masked. He was an old man, perhaps, but he was not a coward. He had lost too much in his life to stand by and watch another vulnerable creature be dragged away, possibly to a fate worse than death. The years of solitude had not entirely extinguished the fire in his spirit. They had merely banked it, waiting for a spark. Mesa, unwittingly, had provided that spark. The tension stretched taut, like a wire about to snap. The wind picked up, whistling around the corners of the cabin, carrying the scent of dust and the faint metallic tang of fear. The sun beat down, mercilessly. Below his feet, in the dark, cramped cellar, Arthur knew Mesa was listening, her breath held, her heart pounding. Her fate, and possibly his own, hung in the balance of these next few moments. He had to make them believe he would fight, that the cost of searching his property would be too high. Vokin considered Arthur, his gaze unwavering. He saw not just an aging rancher, but a man with a certain set to his jaw, a weariness in his eyes that spoke of past sorrows, yet also a glint of unyielding resolve. This was not a man who would be easily cowed. He had expected a quick search, perhaps some bluster, but not this quiet, solid defiance. To force the issue would mean bloodshed, and while they were prepared for it, it complicated matters. Their primary goal was to retrieve Mesa, preferably alive and unharmed. A fight could put her at risk or alert others. "You protect her," Vokin said, more a statement than a question. "Why? She is not your kin. She is nothing to you." Arthur's mind flashed to Martha, to Tom. "She's a frightened girl, running for her life. That's enough for me," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. It was the truth, or as much of it as he understood himself. "Now, I'll say it one last time. Water your horses if you need, then ride out. There's nothing for you here." He shifted his stance slightly, bringing the rifle more to the ready. It was a clear signal. He would not back down. The silence that followed was broken only by the snorting of the horses and the ever-present wind. Vokin held Arthur's gaze for a long moment, then slowly, deliberately, he turned his pony. He spoke to his companions in their own tongue, words too rapid and low for Arthur to catch. There was a brief, sharp exchange. One of the younger warriors looked mutinous, his hand clenching on his weapon, but a curt word from Vokin seemed to settle him. Finally, Vokin looked back at Arthur. His face was a mask of cold anger. "This is not over, old man," he said, his voice like flint. "She belongs with her people. We will find her, and those who stand in our way will regret it." With that, He wheeled his pony and, followed by the other two, rode away, not back the way they had come, but south, towards the broken country along the river. They didn't look back. Arthur remained on the porch, rifle in hand, until they were distant specks on the horizon, swallowed by the vastness of the prairie. Only then did he allow himself to sag slightly against the porch post, the tension draining out of him, leaving him weak and trembling. He had faced them down, but the victory felt hollow, temporary. Vokin's threat echoed in his ears, "This is not over." He waited a full half-hour, scanning the landscape, before he finally went back inside and lifted the trapdoor. "Mesa," he called softly, "they're gone, for now." She emerged slowly, blinking in the relative light of the cabin, her face pale, streaked with dirt and tears. She looked at him, her eyes wide and searching. For the first time, he saw something other than fear in them. It might have been disbelief, or perhaps the dawning of a fragile gratitude. She took a hesitant step towards him, then another. He didn't know what to say. The confrontation had stripped away the layers of his reserve, leaving him feeling raw and exposed. He had risked his life for a stranger, a Kiowa girl he barely knew. He wasn't sure why, not entirely. But as he looked at her, standing there small and shaken in the dim light of his cabin, he knew he didn't regret it. Mesa stopped a few feet from him. She raised a trembling hand and touched her own chest, then gestured towards him. Her lips moved, and a single word, soft as a breath, emerged. "Piav," she whispered. "Thank you." It was a Kiowa word, but the meaning was unmistakable. Arthur nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "You're safe here," he said, and the words felt like a vow. "For as long as I can keep you safe." The immediate danger had passed, but its shadow lingered. Arthur knew Vokin was not a man to make idle threats. They would be back, or they would be watching. The ranch, once his sanctuary of solitude, now felt like a very small, very exposed island in a hostile sea. He moved Mesa's few belongings into the cabin, into the tiny spare room that had once been intended for a child who never grew old enough to use it. It wasn't much, just a narrow cot and a small chest, but it was warmer and safer than the barn. The dynamic between them shifted. The shared crisis had forged a bond, unspoken but palpable. Mesa was still quiet, reserved, but the constant hunted look in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a watchful caution. She started helping with small chores around the cabin, unasked. She swept the floor with a worn broom, her movements neat and efficient. She had a knack for mending, her small fingers surprisingly deft with a needle and thread, patching Arthur's worn shirts better than he ever could. She learned to anticipate his needs, a cup of water ready when he came in from the heat, the fire banked just right in the mornings. Communication remained a challenge, a patchwork of gestures, single words, and patient interpretation. Arthur found himself speaking more than he had in years, explaining simple things, naming objects. "Lamp," he'd say, tapping it. "Kettle." She would repeat the words softly, her pronunciation hesitant at first, then more confident. She, in turn, taught him a few Kiowa words, for water, for food, for horse. They were small bridges across a wide gulf, but they were connections nonetheless. He learned more about her, not in a flood of confession, but in fragments, gleaned from her expressions, her rare, broken English phrases, and the stories she sometimes drew in the dirt with a stick when words failed her. He understood she was fleeing an arranged marriage to an old, cruel man, likely Vokin himself or someone he represented. Her family had agreed to it, for reasons of alliance or status he didn't know. But Mesa had refused, had chosen flight over a life she clearly dreaded. Her courage, her quiet defiance, resonated with something deep inside him. He found himself watching her, the way the light caught the blue-black sheen of her hair, the focused intensity of her expression when she was working on a task, the rare, fleeting smile that would touch her lips when one of the barn cats rubbed against her ankles. These small observations were like discovering new constellations in a familiar sky. His grief for Martha and Tom remained, a dull, permanent ache, but it was no longer the all-consuming darkness it had once been. Mesa's presence had let in a sliver of light, a fragile warmth. Days turned into weeks. The autumn deepened, the prairie grasses turning gold, then brown. The threat of Vokin's return was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of their quiet routine. Arthur took to carrying his rifle everywhere, his senses perpetually alert. He taught Mesa how to load and fire the old shotgun he kept for birds, his hands brushing hers as he showed her the mechanism. Her hands were small but steady. She learned quickly, her expression serious. He hoped she would never have to use it. One evening, a blizzard swept down from the north, a howling white fury that trapped them inside the cabin for 3 days. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the door and windows, piling snowdrifts high against the walls. Inside, the small cabin was an arc of warmth and flickering lamplight. They shared meals, mended tack, and sat by the fire, the silence between them now comfortable, companionable. During a lull in the storm, Mesa picked up a piece of charcoal from the hearth, and on a piece of smooth plank Arthur used for figuring accounts, began to draw. She drew the prairie, the distant mesas, a running horse, its mane flying in the wind. Then, hesitantly, she drew a man, tall and broad-shouldered, standing before a small cabin, a rifle in his hand. She looked up at Arthur, her dark eyes searching his. He knew it was him, the guardian at the gate. He felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her hand. "Good," he said, his voice husky. "Very good." She smiled then, a genuine, open smile that transformed her face, making her look younger, almost carefree. It was a fleeting moment, but it lodged itself in Arthur's memory, a precious thing. In that shared isolation, surrounded by the storm's fury, the last vestiges of mistrust between them seemed to melt away. He was no longer just her protector, she was no longer just a runaway. They were two solitary souls who had found an unlikely refuge in each other. The blizzard eventually blew itself out, leaving behind a world transformed, draped in pristine white. The immediate threat of Vokeen seemed distant, buried under the snow. But Arthur knew it was a temporary reprieve. They would wait for the thaw, for easier travel. Spring arrived slowly, tentatively, then burst forth in a rush of green. The prairie came alive with wildflowers, and the air hummed with the sound of insects and birdsong. With the changing season came a renewed sense of unease. Arthur found himself scanning the horizon more frequently, his old anxieties resurfacing. It happened on a bright May morning. Arthur was repairing a corral fence, Mesa nearby tending a small patch of garden she had started, coaxing stubborn life from the dry soil. He heard the drumming of hooves first, a sound that sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He looked up. 4 riders this time, not 3. Vokeen was among them, his expression even more grim than before. "Mesa, inside," Arthur yelled, grabbing his rifle. She didn't hesitate, dropping her trowel and running for the cabin. Arthur stood his ground by the corral, his heart pounding. This was it. The confrontation he had dreaded, yet somehow known, was inevitable. Vokeen and his men reined in, forming a semicircle around him. They were armed, their faces set. "Old man," Vokeen said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "We have come for what is ours. Give us the girl. There will be no more talk." "She's not yours to take," Arthur said, his voice equally steady. "She stays here." "Then you will die with her," Vokeen stated, and he raised his rifle. The next moments were a blur of sound and motion. Arthur fired, his shot aimed at Vokeen's horse, hoping to unseat him, to create chaos. The horse screamed and reared, throwing Vokeen to the ground. The other warriors opened fire. A bullet whizzed past Arthur's ear, another thudded into the corral post beside him, sending splinters flying. He ducked, fired again, then scrambled for better cover behind a water trough. He heard a shot from the cabin, then another. Mesa. She was firing the shotgun, the blasts deafening. One of the warriors cried out, clutching his arm. The unexpected resistance from the cabin seemed to momentarily stun them. Arthur used the distraction to reload. Vokeen was back on his feet, his face contorted with rage. He bellowed an order, and his men pressed their attack, firing more methodically now. It was a desperate fight. Arthur knew he couldn't hold them off for long. He was pinned down, and Mesa, brave as she was no match for seasoned warriors. Then, just as he thought all was lost, he heard it, the thunder of more hooves, coming fast from the east, from the direction of the settlement. A group of riders, at least half a dozen, emerged over the rise, rifles glinting in the sun. It was Caleb Weston, a neighboring rancher with whom Arthur had a grudging respect, and several other men from the sparse community. Arthur had helped Weston during a cattle rustling scare the previous year, a small act of solidarity in a land where neighbors, however distant, sometimes had to rely on each other. Someone must have seen Vokin's party heading this way earlier and ridden for help. The arrival of reinforcements changed the equation entirely. Vokin and his men, seeing they were now outnumbered and outgunned, hesitated. After a tense standoff with rifles leveled on both sides, Vokin snarled a curse. He knew a lost cause when he saw one. With a final hate-filled glare at Arthur and the cabin, he signaled his men. They wheeled their ponies and rode away, hard and fast, disappearing over the western horizon. This time Arthur sensed they would not be back. The cost had become too high. Slowly, Arthur lowered his rifle. His hands were shaking. He was alive. Mesa was alive. He saw Caleb Weston and the others approaching, their faces concerned. "You all right, Arthur?" Caleb called out, dismounting. "Saw those renegades headin' this way. Figured there might be trouble." "Appreciate the help, Caleb," Arthur said, his voice hoarse. "More than you know." Mesa emerged from the cabin, the shotgun still clutched in her hands, her face pale but resolute. She looked at Arthur, then at the departing riders, then at the men who had come to their aid. The immediate threat was gone. A profound weariness settled over Arthur, but beneath it there was a sense of relief so immense it was almost painful. He had faced the darkness and, with unexpected help, had come through. In the aftermath, a new equilibrium settled upon the small ranch. The incident had drawn Arthur, however reluctantly, back into the sparse fabric of the local community. Men stopped by more often, ostensibly to check on him, but also to offer a quiet word of support. They had seen his courage, his willingness to defend the girl. Prejudice was a stubborn weed, but respect, once earned, had deep roots. Mesa, too, began to find her place. The terror of pursuit slowly faded from her eyes, replaced by a quiet confidence. She continued to tend her small garden, which, against all odds, began to flourish. She learned more English, and Arthur, in turn, learned more Kiowa. Their conversations became easier, deeper. She spoke of her childhood, of the beauty of the plains before they were crossed with fences, of her fear of the life that had been chosen for her. He listened, understanding more than he could say. He never asked her to stay. He never asked her to go. He simply made a space for her in his life, in his home, and she, in turn, filled a void he hadn't fully acknowledged was there. The silence in the cabin was no longer heavy with grief. It was filled with the quiet sounds of shared existence, the scrape of a chair, the murmur of voices, the crackle of the fire. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Mesa turned to him. "This is home now," she said softly, her English almost perfect. "If you will have me." Arthur looked at her, at the young woman who had stumbled into his life, bringing chaos and fear, but also, unexpectedly, a reason to live beyond mere habit. He saw the strength in her, the resilience, the quiet dignity. He thought of Martha and Tom, not with the sharp stab of pain he once felt, but with a gentle sorrow, a sense of peace. Their memory was a part of him, always would be, but it no longer defined the entirety of his existence. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were small, but her grip was firm. "This is your home, Mesa," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For as long as you want it." A sense of earned peace settled over him, a quiet contentment he hadn't thought possible. The ranch was still isolated, the land still harsh, but it was no longer a place of lonely exile. It was a place of connection, of shared purpose. He had faced adversity, not just from the elements or the loneliness, but from the violent prejudice of others, and through it all, an unexpected kindness had been given and received. He had hidden a runaway, not knowing the storm she would bring, but in weathering that storm together, they had both found a resilience they didn't know they possessed, and a belonging that felt as solid and enduring as the ancient prairie itself. The journey had been one of healing, not just for Mesa, but for the solitary rancher who had almost forgotten what it meant to care, what it meant to protect, what it meant to truly live. The future was uncertain, as it always was on the frontier, but now they would face it together.